Wow, it's a full house. Thank you for coming. Who says people don't care about human rights anymore? Thank you. The point of this is the launch of a book that we started roughly 2.5 years ago on human rights that just came out. You have in your hands, those of you who could get it before the copies ran out, the first run, print editions. There's going to be a fuller run in November, just in time for the holidays. Nothing says I love you like giving the gift of human rights for those of you who want to give it to a loved one. But it's also free, actually, as an ebook on our website. This book grew out of a op-ed I wrote for the Washington Post about 2.5, almost 3 years ago. That talked about the curious situation where the Donald Trump administration was implicitly, perhaps unexpectedly, siding and allying itself with two countries that its own national security advisor, John Bolton, had called the Troika of Tyranny. It was stiff-arming the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and refusing to cooperate, just like Nicaragua was doing, and just like Venezuela was doing. And it raised a question: how, when the US is not all that cooperative often on matters of human rights, international organizations, but why suddenly is a populist government, one of the, if you will, founders of the International Liberal Order, now suddenly deciding to sort of ally itself and thwart international human rights? It got me thinking that suddenly it did just seem that, unlike the past 70 years, when human rights has never been an easy sell, it's always been pushed back against by questions of national sovereignty, questions of ideology, questions of state collapse in many cases. Now suddenly it seemed that the challenges were different. The challenges were new, whether it was the rise of national populist movements, not just to government, places like Turkey, places like the US, places like Poland and Hungary, but also national populist movements in, say, the Netherlands or France or Sweden now, that were changing very much the dynamics about human rights, pushing and pulling, if you will, the party systems become much less tolerant of migrants' rights, for example, and in many ways violating the very foundations and very norms that they themselves had signed. By the same token, even in, of course, the UK, we're talking about sending migrants to Rwanda. And suddenly this doesn't seem to provoke the level of indignation that one would have thought, say, 10, 20 years ago. Maybe I'm being romantic and thinking about that. But the truth is, it did seem that something was very different. By the same token, you had China and Russia and Turkey making common cause with other autocrats, and Venezuela, in the Philippines, and suddenly, and even justifying, for example, the coup d'etat in Myanmar, that it did just seem that not just this alliance and not just the cases of individual countries pushing back, either domestically or internationally, that the basic notions of human rights norms and international institutions to defend them were becoming much more contested. So with that idea, based on the op-ed, I pulled together an amazing group of authors. We'll hear from some of them today, to look at these different dimensions. I won't go through the entire book, but basically what we look at are the rise of China and how geopolitical competition and China's efforts to rebuild, if you will, sort of the international order more to its liking and more to its interests. The rise of Russia by two authors at McGill University in Canada. We talk about the rise of what Alex Cooley at Columbia, an author, talks the counter norms, the efforts by Russia and China to create sort of parallel organizations, parallel NGOs, governmental NGOs, to contest human rights norms within institutions. We talk about the rise of national populism. Gerald Newman, professor at Harvard University Law School, talks about the rise of populism, its effects not just on domestic politics, in fact, more on international norms and support for human rights. We talk about the rise of evangelicals and how, oddly, evangelicals are making common cause often with, in the US, an effort to rewrite progressive human rights under the Trump administration, under Mike Pompeo, but also making common cause with the government of Uganda to roll back LGBTQI rights or roll back women's rights, or even making an alliance with Putin and the World Council of Churches. Again, something very different than what we saw before. We also talk about the rise of technology. Kate Jones, who's here, along with Emily Taylor and Carolina Caito, talk about China's efforts to rewrite the international protocols for the internet and the effects that will have on privacy and monitoring. We also talk about then regional human rights issues, the issue of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and its sort of challenges within Latin America, the problems within the European human rights system, problems presented by Poland and Hungary. We even see this now, for example, with the UK saying it's going to write its own Bill of Rights on human rights. We talk about the human rights system in the Middle East, which isn't really a system so much, but it is obviously caught within this dynamic of geopolitics and the rise of extremism. And then last, we talk about the problems within the African human rights system. So it's a comprehensive book. It's a thick book, I will say. I hope you enjoy it. I like to think it's well written and readable. But we also end with recommendations. We are a think tank. We're not here just to think, actually. We're actually here to recommend policy steps. And so each of the chapters concludes with recommendations. And then the final chapter was the result of a series of conversations we had with young leaders through our next generation projects and academy fellows and so on, and then also with human rights activists. And those reflect those recommendations. So there we have it. Human rights. It's definitely a challenge today. But as we'll hear from the authors and from Ambassador Villegas, we shouldn't lose faith. One of the things that happened in the course of planning and writing this and editing this project was obviously we were just reminded constantly how relevant it was, whether it's human rights violations, crimes against humanity in Ukraine by Russia, whether it's the rise of national populism again in Sweden or the Netherlands. And of course, also with the challenges that we're seeing in Poland and Hungary and the removal of Russia from the European system. So in all these cases, we're kind of reminded this is relevant. Luckily, it didn't outstrip the project. You always have this fear that suddenly, like what you're writing is, by the time it gets published, it's going to be sort of passé or anachronistic. I don't think it is. I think the problems that we've identified are still real. I hope the recommendations are valid. So what we'll do is Ambassador Villegas is going to speak, and then we'll have a panel. The bios of the people are up there. Since this is a book launch, I'll assume a certain amount of literacy, so I don't need to read them for you. But Ambassador Villegas is the president of the UNHRC. Obviously, he's also served at the Organization of American States and worked with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. He's a friend of the human rights community. And then we'll hear from Rosemary Foote, who's unfortunately has COVID, so couldn't be here in person. But she's a real trooper and is actually here virtually from Oxford. She is a professor emeritus at Oxford University. And Rana Mustafa, who's also here virtually because she couldn't get her visa to come to the United Kingdom, unfortunately. She's a professor of law at Alexandria Law School. And then we have Kate Jones, who was able to make it from Oxford, didn't need a visa. And was healthy. And Chanu, who's a friend, but also the deputy director of the International Law Program, is going to provide comments. So Ambassador Villegas, please take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Thanks to Chatham House for the opportunity, of course, for being with you today. I'll try in 10 minutes to give you 10 ideas or thoughts, or maybe information. First of all, this has been one of the most challenging years in the history of the Human Rights Council, by far, since it was created. But at the same time, this year was the year that the Human Rights Council became the intergovernmental body of the whole UN system with the highest presence in social media. So the whole UN system, General Assembly, Security Council, we have highest presence and followers than any other body. So why is that? For some reason, common people like you in the tube, relate in some way to what we do, because we address basically the human rights of everybody, everywhere, all the time, 24/7. But it has been a very challenging year, I have to say, because as captain of the boat, I chair a body of 47 states that are very different one from each other, with different views, cultures, religions, geopolitics. The P5 were members of the council for the first time all together at the beginning. But during the whole year, I had countries trying for me to put all the weight in the boat in the front or in the back. And until the last day, I'm doing on a daily basis, trying to keep the boat floating. Because if you put all the weight in the front or in the back, it will sink. So we became this very present body because we do some things that for some reason work. First of all, the social media showed that people are going back to the basic notion of human rights. You know, the basic notion from the human point of view is this idea to have empathy for other people's suffering without having a personal interest in that other person. One thing is to suffer because your son or your friend is suffering. There you have a personal take. But what shows the social media and the interest in the council is that we deal with people suffering everywhere. And the power of social media has shown that following the Human Rights Council, they are following whoever is being killed or tortured or persecuted in any part of the world. We do other things, which is a universal periodic review. That's a very important tool that I think we have to see in perspective for the future. For 50 years, the Commission of Human Rights, which was before the Council, didn't only address the human rights situation of some countries, between 5 and 7. Over 185 countries never had to put their human rights situation on the table, and especially not to listen to other countries, tell them what should do better, or NGOs. And so this tool that was created with the Council is a revolutionary tool, because we do have every single country of the member of the UN putting every 3-4 years their human rights situation on the table and getting an average of 200 recommendations by other states. Developed and underdeveloped countries all get an average of 200 recommendations. So that powerful tool is changing dramatically now in the field, because if you look at those recommendations, they are basically a road to development in a country with a human rights perspective. And that's what we are doing now. Second role is to address human rights situations, serious human rights situations. And so, of course, it's obvious that here on serious human rights situation, if you look at the headlines in the last weeks, you might think that the only important thing has been the Council not deciding to have a debate on the report of Xinjiang, of the Office of the High Commission. But let me tell you that in dealing with addressing human rights situation, 4 days after the invasion of Ukraine, while the Security Council was paralyzed without acting, a whole collective security system that we created for this not to happen or to react if it happened was absolutely paralyzed with a veto by the same country that breached the charter. 4 days after that in Geneva, in the Council of Human Rights, we approved a historic urgent debate on the situation, and we approved a commission of inquiry to investigate violations of human rights in the conflict. Never happened before in the history to approve a commission of inquiry on a permanent member of the Security Council. And then in June, in the session, that commission of inquiry presented a report which clearly states all the violations that are being committed in the ground, which will be one of the most important elements for any accountability on these atrocities. And guess how we finished last session on Friday? Approving a special rapporteur on the human rights situation in the Russian Federation. Again, historic, never a P5 had a special rapporteur on human rights created on them. And at the same time, we address accountability mechanisms on Ethiopia, Burundi, Venezuela, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, and Afghanistan, only in this session. And then the other role, which is very important, is we are the hub of progressive development of human rights norms and standards. What we do in our sessions is create new standards that will protect you and future generations to have more and better protected the rights. And just to name a few, last year, after 20 years of having discussions on environment from the environmental point of view, from the socio-economical point of view, we approved that a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right. And that was the Council, and now the General Assembly adopted that as a human right. So imagine how much it's going to be changed the attitude towards the environment with a human rights perspective. And only in this session, just to mention a few, 4 new issues were adopted by consensus. Neurotechnology and human rights, cyberbullying, the human rights implication of new military technologies, like the killer robots, and the impact on human rights of the legacy of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. So unfortunately, those new mandates are at the same time all together with old mandates, because gross violations like enforced disappearance, torture, persecution, arbitrary detentions continue to occur everywhere. So which is the future? If I'm in Chatham House, let me quote Winston Churchill. And my favorite quote of Churchill is always, he has many, but the one I like, because I like historic perspective, is the further backward you look, the further forward you can see. And definitely, to understand what's the future of human rights, we have to see where we come from. And so if we go back to Westphalia, from 1648 to 1948, for 300 years, international law as such didn't care much about people, cared about the interests of states. And that was how our international law was created. We had attempts of caring about people, minorities. We were able to have a social contract to abolish slavery, but international law as such didn't care of people. And this revolutionary idea that a person has rights beyond being a national of a state or another, beyond religion, beyond culture, and that the collective, the international community collectively has to protect that right, is absolutely a revolutionary idea. But it's a revolution of only 74 years old. In matters of history, in historical perspective, is nothing. So the first thing to understand what's the future of human rights is that we are in the middle of the revolution. We are living a revolution. Because if you look at the 193 countries, there are still 77 countries that criminalize same-sex relations, 27 with death penalty, and 5 that apply death penalty. And on women's rights, that we had so many gains, we are witnessing this year how many regressions on women's rights, not only on developing countries, on developed countries, or on migrants, or on basic refugee law standards. But at the same time, there's hope, because in the last month, the same way that we had bad news, I would say, from the global north, we had good news from the global south. Let's look at the last month. Cuba, by a referendum, over almost 70% of the population decided to accept same-sex marriage, including adoption of children. Singapore decided to eliminate the criminalization of same-sex relations in their code. Sierra Leone decided to abolish the death penalty. Malaysia changed their same-sex law also. So you see, those countries did not do those things because of the Western values imposing. It was their own societies that were able, for some reason that every society has a dynamic that we don't understand, why Europe is going backwards in basic rights that the whole European project was based on. We don't know that. It's a dynamic within European societies. Why the far right is back after such a progressive way of doing a European project. Each country is a different laboratory. But what we are seeing is that the future of human rights should not should overcome this idea of the good and the bad. We will not have a future of human rights law continuing developing if we don't get this idea out of the table of that some countries do well and others don't, and the ones that do well should teach the others how to do it. That is from the past. It's a discourse that is not efficient and it doesn't work. And at the end, I would like to also emphasize two things. First, it's time for us to put our money and our institutions where our mouth is. You know, in 2000, we approved that there are 3 pillars in the UN: peace and security, development, and human rights, that the 3 are mutually reinforcing. And even Kofi Annan said, the most important of the 3 is human rights. There's no peace and security without human rights. There's no sustainable development. But you know what? Human rights system in the UN has 4% of the budget. 4, not 14, 4. And if you add the human rights peacekeeping component in peacekeeping operations, it's only 7%. So definitely, you cannot have one pillar that is so essential. And sometimes the problem is that people think that human rights are cheaper. But let's be honest, it's cheaper to have strong human rights institutions set in order to prevent a conflict and not to have a peacekeeping operation. What could have happened if we had had an efficient system for Russia to address the problem of Russian minorities in Ukraine? A system that was put forward in a way that everybody felt the ownership of the system and be able to say, I want a special rapporteur on Russian minorities in Ukraine because I'm worried about Russian minorities. I want to have a special session on this, on that. And all the elements were at the disposal to address those issues. And to use the R2P concept as an excuse to invade a country to protect a minority with the human rights system that we have is something that shows that our system doesn't work for everybody. What we need in the future of our system is that everybody feels that owns the system and use the system for good. And last point is the socio-economical right. One of the big things that we should do in the future, I think, is to realize that we had a fundamentalism in the post-Cold War era that we need to acknowledge and change in order to bring closer the global north and the global south, and that is social economical rights. In the post-Cold War era, we all read history in one way. One side won over the other because they had a better way of organizing themselves politically, socially, and economically. But that extreme vision that was the only reality with the end of history, Fukuyama, etc., was that the absence of the state was something good, and that the private sector was the panacea to solve everything. And look what happened after that extreme vision. We destroyed the planet, and inequality raised at obscene levels, like we are having. So now we need human rights as the way to put that pendulum in the middle. And if we are able, all countries, to look seriously at socio-economical rights the same way we do with civil and political rights, I think next year, the Vienna, 30 years of the Vienna Declaration is the great opportunity to look at the future of human rights with this pendulum bringing everybody together with a vision of interdependency, universality of rights. So I prefer to stop here, and any questions? I have more things to say, but I prefer just to wait for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. He will answer questions when go ahead and applaud. I'm all for that. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask the authors a few questions based on the book, and then Chana is going to provide a sort of review of the book, hopefully not a critical one, but that's allowed as well. Yeah, there's a lot to say. I want to say before I do, though, I want to thank Caroline Soper and Amanda Moss for this is an insights book. It's published by Chatham House and by Brookings Institution. They helped shepherd this entire thing along. It is not always a smooth ride. Perhaps even working with me was not always a smooth ride. So I want to thank them both for their persistence, perfectionism, and commitment to it. So thank you very much for this. Let me start first with you, Rosemary. How is China, and you talk about this in the chapter, how is China beginning to shape the discourse in human rights? Not just obviously around its own prerogatives of national sovereignty, but in other countries as well. I mentioned Myanmar. Obviously, it embraced the coup d'etat in Myanmar when that occurred. What are your thoughts on China's role in this writ large?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris, for inviting me to be part of this project and this evening. And my apologies for not being able to be there, but obviously you wouldn't want to be standing next to me with COVID symptoms. So, and thanks to the ambassador actually for very insightful remarks. I'd like to say something about the Chinese position on rights, because I think it actually responds to some of the points that the ambassador has raised already. And as you rightly say, they make the argument that, the normative argument that legal sovereign equality of states, non-interference in internal affairs, excuse me, are the most important norms governing state-to-state relations and actually in creating global order. And they argue that the state is the best guarantor of human rights. And they have actually sort of attacked the idea of the universality of rights, arguing that all countries must proceed from prevailing realities and go their own way. They argue that attention to subsistence and development has driven the human rights progress in their own country. And by implication, they are putting this forward as a solution for other developing countries, as shown in Beijing's introduction of resolutions at the Human Rights Council, actually emphasizing this point. And actually, China has been able to garner support within the Human Rights Council, not only for these resolutions, but also for other arguments that it's been putting forward. There is a like-minded group that operates within the Human Rights Council, and sometimes they work together with China to promote the idea of development as a foundational right, or the idea that countries need to go their own way rather than emphasizing universality of rights. Sometimes they support China in part because of the important economic relationship that they might have with China. Sometimes because states fear that their own records are actually going to be the subject of criticism and sanctions and so on. And also a number of states are impressed, of course, by China's successes in transitioning from one of the poorest developing countries. They built coalitions of support. And perhaps one of the best examples that I'd like to bring up is that we just witnessed last week when the Human Rights Council handed China a closely fought victory by rejecting a proposal to hold a debate on the findings of the report that came out of the UN High Commission for Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, detailing abuses against mainly Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Now, there were 19 votes against holding the debate, 17 for holding the debate, and 11 abstentions. And importantly, only one African country out of 13 African states actually voted for having the debate on the UN report. So I think we can say that China has been influential in shaping understandings of human rights at the Human Rights Council. And I would say actually shaping the institution itself. So, for example, the Universal Periodic Review process, which I agree with the ambassador is an extraordinarily important process, nevertheless has been turned into an opportunity to praise states for the progress that they have made in human rights protection, and less emphasis put on the idea of accountability. And similarly, within the Human Rights Council, again, it's been difficult for NGOs, independent NGOs, to make their points, to make their voices heard. So I think that within the Human Rights Council itself, China has been able to shape it in ways that are worrying for the progress of human rights. And that would be true of other international organizations of which China is a part, something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example. Again, that the SCO emphasizes state sovereignty, non-interference in internal affairs as the most important norm. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization has adopted Chinese language in respect of security, put that language into treaty form, and security treaties developed within that body of the SCO have had direct and negative human rights consequences, especially again affecting those Uyghurs that have fled to these Central Asian states and sought sanctuary there. So their particular struggle has been described as coming under the heading of the three evils: separatism, terrorism, extremism. So I think there are real challenges for human rights within international organizations, international institutions, and that China has been leading the charge to influence both the way we think about human rights normatively and how we deal with it within institutional structures.
What Rosemary says about the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was created by China and Russia, fields fake election monitors. It's written about in detail by Rosemary, but also Alex Cooley, but there's an equivalent in Latin America, the CELAC, the community of Latin American Caribbean states, that also is sort of emphasizing notions of national sovereignty over issues of popular sovereignty. Kate, this is a good time to turn to you a little bit about your sense. I mean, you're a human rights lawyer generally, but then you combine forces with Emily and Catalina to talk about the threats on internet security. What are your thoughts on sort of China's role in this and the like?
Yes, thank you, Chris. And it's a pleasure to be here and to be involved with the book. We'll turn the lens a little bit, I think, to technology, and we'll come back to China in just a moment, and to challenges that the emergence of new technology poses for human rights. And I'll draw two examples of this, which illustrate two different points. The first is that emerging technologies can offer authoritarian states new ways of bypassing human rights and even the international human rights system. So in my chapter, which I co-wrote with two fantastic experts on tech governance, Carolina Caro and Emily Taylor, we looked at Chinese proposals to bring forward a new type of internet called New IP, which they did not in a human rights body, but in a technical standards body in the International Telecommunications Union, another organization in Geneva, a couple of years ago. And they were concerned that this would have created a new internet, different from the internet that we have, and potentially not interoperable with it. So you essentially end up with two different internets. And I was very concerned that this new model of internet that they were proposing would have ridden roughshod over human rights, because it would essentially have embedded surveillance deep into the internet stack. So not just at the application layer of the internet, but much deeper, so that those operating the internet would be able to see precisely who is doing what and the content of what they're saying. So immediately you see a lot more surveillance online, you see limitations on freedom of expression, on freedom of assembly, potentially risks to economic and social cultural rights, a great range of potential human rights implications. And had these proposals gone through at the ITU, they would have done so without the awareness of the Human Rights Council and the human rights institutions. And that was the concern, that suddenly this would have been created and agreed internationally in a technical body where staffed mostly by engineers, where human rights hasn't traditionally been prominent, and without the involvement of these human rights bodies. Now, that proposal was defeated. There are still bits of it being proposed in standards bodies. And I know that the Human Rights Council has since passed a resolution to encourage work to look much at how the human rights bodies in Geneva can work much more closely with standards bodies in order to make sure that human rights is actually given its proper place. But still, the episode is an example of how technologies offer opportunities to bypass human rights in new and unexpected ways. And then the second thing that I'd like to touch on briefly in relation to technology, which actually comes slightly out of what the ambassador was saying, is that it's mostly being developed in the private sector. It's the small state taken to an extreme. Most tech development is in the private sector, and governance by states is a long way behind. So I've been involved in other research for Chatham House, working with Chanu and others on artificial intelligence and human rights, where what we see is that the private sector developing AI, which is going to, and is already and will much more affect all of our lives, they're working very hard on AI ethics. And that's great, that's very noble, but for the most part, AI ethics doesn't take account of human rights. And it's a little bit like the 1940s. I'm so glad you mentioned history and Winston Churchill, because at the moment, everybody supports AI ethics without exactly knowing what it is. There are about 170 different sets of AI ethics principles. And it's a bit like in the 1940s, everybody supported human rights, but it then took several years of very hard work to come up with a universal declaration of human rights that actually encapsulated what was meant by human rights. And so the risk here is that human rights gets bypassed as AI is developed. Governments are quite far behind the technology. And similarly, the international system tries to play catch up and to sort of be imposing norms, but you have the technology moving forward very, very fast. And what we need is for the tech community and the human rights community to be talking to each other much, much more, so that you actually get human rights in at the ground level, in emerging technology, in as technology is being developed, so that we preserve those human rights and maintain them as we move to a more AI-defined age. I'll stop there, Chris.
Let me ask you a follow-up question. What are other forums in which this is being pursued? Because obviously you mentioned one, but tech standards generally are sort of, they touch many different areas. So are there other forums that we should be looking out for as human rights activists or human rights scholars and practitioners?
So there are a great range of human rights technical standards bodies, each of which have their own acronyms, and I could start listing out acronyms. Yeah, exactly. But and they operate in slightly different ways. And so, but this issue can potentially arise in any of them. But some of them are much more linked into sort of multi-stakeholder environments where there is much more of a focus on keeping the one global open internet that we have today than others. So without getting too much into kind of the technical specifics, it's a range of standards organizations, but we need to focus primarily actually on the UN bodies like the ITU. And one aspect of this is making sure that all the different parts of the UN are speaking the same language and speaking to the same tune, which I'm sure is something that the Secretary General would be supporting.
Good, thank you very much. Rana, you wrote about COVID and the effects of COVID on human rights and the ways in which some multilateral organizations weren't quite fit for purpose to address issues of human rights in the midst of the pandemic, which is, by the way, when we were writing and editing the book. So it was very much on our minds. But of course, now there are other issues too, environmental crises, future pandemics. What are your thoughts on what we learned from the use and abuse of COVID or an emergency and its effects on human rights?
Thank you so much, Chris, for the invitation first. It has been an honorable and enriching experience to be involved in this book. So speaking about threats, whether they are pandemics, public health emergencies, environmental crises, threats to human rights are not only specific to COVID-19, but has been long acknowledged in the international human rights instruments, as they allow states to limit human rights or temporarily suspend their enjoyment only if certain conditions are there. But despite this limitations and derogations framework, states, they tend not to comply with this framework, and they tend to adopt excessive, unnecessary, and even measures that pursue illegitimate purposes under the pretext of responding to those threats. But COVID-19, it came with its new challenges because it had an unprecedented geographical threat. It nearly affected all states. So it led to restrictions on human rights on the global scale, which had unprecedented implications on human rights. If one could just mention, there has been an unprecedented decline in human development worldwide. Not only this, but COVID-19 also came about in a context of rising populism, of rising authoritarianism, of growing tensions between the powerful states, notably United States and China. So this has not only hindered cooperation, which was most needed during the pandemic, but it has also created an imminent risk that violations on human rights will fast be normalized. So against this background, just to move quickly to what lessons can we learn from COVID-19 in order for a better protection of human rights during future crises, whether they are health or climate crisis or global food insecurity. I would just like to first say that these lessons, they were there before COVID-19, but COVID-19 brought them to the forefront as indispensable lessons for a better protection of human rights. So COVID-19 has emphasized that adopting a human rights-based approach to responses to human crises is indispensable for a better protection of human rights. COVID-19 has stressed on the interdependency of all human rights, as Mr. Ambassador has just mentioned, that neither civil and political rights prevail over social and economic rights, nor the other way around. So this interdependency between the human rights, they need a holistic, coordinated protection of human rights from the international and regional human rights institutions. And besides that, a timely protection of human rights is very important in order to not to lose the hard-won gains in the fields of human rights, in order to be able to build back better. Indeed, our international and regional human rights institutions are not fit to provide timely responses, but maybe I will come to that back later. But a timely and a holistic response during pandemics, during future crises, is a vital component for a protection of human rights in the future. So COVID-19 as well invites us to review the measures in the toolbox for the protection of human rights during human crisis. Because while some measures may work during normal times, they may not be effective enough during the crisis, but instead they may cause a double harm, being counterproductive to the protection of human rights, and at the same time, they are going to be increase the tensions between states, incentivizing states to cooperation, which is the vital component for responding to a crisis. So I think COVID-19 calls us to revisit this toolbox for the protection of human rights. And maybe I can conclude just a little bit quick by a very important lesson from COVID-19 to future crises, which is that multilateralism has been and should still be the foundation for the protection of human rights in normal times and in the future crisis, and the international community should thus work on strengthening it. And maybe I'll stop here, Chris, and return back to you.
Thank you very much, Rana. I actually want to go, before we go to China, and I'm going to ask Rosemary for some recommendations, but Ambassador Villegas, these issues that we just talked about, obviously COVID-19, you were there. Some advances were made in being able to bring people in virtually to participate, but what are your, I mean, both on China and technology and now COVID, what are your reflections on that, sitting where you were sitting through all of this process, let's say?
Well, COVID-19 definitely is a world-shaping event for multilateralism, but also an impact on all these institutions. For example, the discussion on internet, what type of internet. We all discover now that we took for granted the type of internet that we've been doing and enjoying for the last 20 years. And the discussion on the elections of the ITU, there was a Russian candidate against an American candidate. And basically, there was two types of looking at the internet, one closer to the Chinese version. So in the COVID-19, when we talk about social economical rights, for example, it's interesting that you mentioned on multilateralism. One of the first discussions was the intellectual property on vaccines. And that was a very technical discussion. And in a week, became a geopolitical discussion. And the WTO, the World Trade Organization, that is the one administering the treaties on intellectual property, realized there was a social function of intellectual property in a crisis like this. The same way we did with HIV. In Africa today, we were able to get the drugs to everybody at a cheap price, at an accessible price, because of a dramatic change in the way to look at intellectual property on those drugs. And we tried to bring that discussion from a human rights perspective, but it's very difficult. You know, each organization is a whole world in itself.
Yeah. Rosemary, I want to go back to you quickly. Great synthesis of the challenges and activities and impacts of China, mostly in the UNHRC. What are your recommendations? Can you synthesize some of the recommendations you have in the chapter on this? Because it's delicate, obviously,
Yeah.
given its rise.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all states and including China need to be reminded that the requirements of the human rights treaties they've signed are that we accept that our human rights behavior is subject to international scrutiny. There is the idea that non-interference in internal affairs is the overriding norm in international relations, is belied by the fact that we have international human rights treaties that require us to be concerned, as the ambassador put it, to have empathy for individuals wherever they may be. As human beings, we should be concerned. So as I say, non-interference in internal affairs needs to be challenged. I think also the undermining by China of the idea of the universality and the indivisibility of rights also needs to be challenged. And it's an idea, obviously, that's reflected in the two covenants. China has signed and ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, but has only signed, never ratified the Covenant on International Civil and Political Rights. I think also that we need to be aware and to think about, as scholars and as practitioners, of China's establishment of a South-South Forum on human rights that has met on 3 occasions. It meets every 2 years, and it has established a Beijing Declaration on Rights, which again is very reflective of the Chinese perspective as I've outlined it. And the implications of that is that there could well be spillover from this body, a South-South Forum body, affecting the work of the Human Rights Council. But I'd like to add something, Chris, if I may, just about the US side of things, because if so much of this is sort of debated through a kind of US-China lens in various international bodies at the UN and elsewhere. And I think the United States itself, if it's going to be persuasive in the kinds of arguments that it's making with respect to human rights and democracy promotion and so on, it needs definitely to retain humility about the country's own human rights failings. It needs to continue to attack ideas about distributional unfairness in the United States and outside of the United States, unfairness about discrimination, again, inside the US and outside of the US. And I think Biden and Blinken have tried to send that message, and I would encourage them to continue to do so. So what I'm saying is that in order for the United States and other countries to build a wide consistency of support for positions on human rights, they need to recognize the source of inequities within their own societies, but also that source of inequity around the globe. And again, referring to the ambassador's remarks about the importance of paying attention to social, economic, and cultural rights. We should be working with others to provide investment, to provide aid. This doesn't have to be seen only through a competitive lens with respect to the Chinese approach and infrastructure projects, Belt and Road initiatives, and so on. Again, health and education, important, as Rana has said, important sectors where the developed democratic world can better compete and can do far more. So those are some of my recommendations. I hope they make some sense. And
Chana, before I go to it's very strong and very powerful, and obviously, the moral authority to speak out on human rights depends on a certain amount of honesty and integrity on one's own human rights failings. It's absolutely right. Before I get to you, Chana, I just want to ask, we were talking before about renewing and refreshing the discourse on human rights. Tell me a little bit. I think it's an important point.
Absolutely. I mean, it was very refreshing to hear from the ambassador on social media. It's the Human Rights Council that receives the most interest of all of the UN institutions, because I think that in some parts of the world, including, for example, in this country and parts of the West, human rights currently has a bit of an image problem. It's seen as old-fashioned, or it's seen as clunky, or it's seen as getting in the way of innovation, or it's seen as something that stops governments from enacting their policies. And too often, it is a bit of a stalking horse of governments or of the media. Oh, we can't do what we want to do because this human rights gets in the way. And I think that is really problematic because of exactly what the ambassador said at the beginning about how human rights is about universal empathy and about how human rights is really a mantle that clothes each of us and allows us to live our lives free from discrimination and being able to say as what we wish and to meet with whom we wish and all those other wonderful freedoms. And of course, the economic, social, and cultural rights as well. And so I think we need to be thinking carefully about how we redress that and show that actually human rights is a very, very sophisticated system that has really careful checks and balances and balancing of rights and interests that are engaged in a particular situation. So that whether you're talking about kind of traditional scenarios or whether you're talking about artificial intelligence, actually human rights has scope to develop and to provide answers about ways that you can have innovation and you can have tech development while at the same time looking after the rights of everybody. And I feel that everybody who cares about human rights needs to be thinking about what we can do to refresh its image for this 21st century we're in.
Thank you. Yes, very good. There'll be questions, so prepare your questions. But before, Chana, your reflections on the book, and also your ongoing work on this topic.
Happy to. But I'll start, Chris, by offering my congratulations to you and to the authors and everyone involved in producing this book. To have written on human rights in recent years is like dealing with both moving goalposts as well as changing goalkeepers. And if I'm really to belabor the analogy, sometimes shifting teammates. So well done. And I have similar experiences doing the Human Rights Pathways Project in the International Law Program. If I understand correctly, I'm supposed to give a live book review.
Live book review in 5 minutes. Can you do it?
Great.
All right.
So I'll perhaps borrow from the structure of the book, which talks about the international mechanisms. It talks about regional, national, and one key cross-cutting theme. What I'll attempt to do is talk about some of the key the common threads, as well as where the conversation can perhaps go moving forward beyond this book. So starting with human rights diplomacy, as we've heard, the international sphere is very much characterized by a disruptive Russia, an ever ambitious China, and a more reticent Anglo-American bloc. And China's particular approach being incredibly attractive, particularly to developing states, with the focus on development first and non-intervention in sovereign affairs. But the Xinjiang resolution, although disappointing, I think suggests that China's success and normative power isn't as wholesale as we could perhaps instinctively guess. And this is illustrated by the fact that the resolution failed by a margin of 2 votes. Other indicators that the bubble is perhaps bursting can be seen in the example of Sri Lanka, which very much espoused China's approach to development and non-intervention, but is currently facing economic collapse. And what we're seeing in Sri Lanka is, at the very grassroots level, a call for accountability for the first time and a recognition of the interdependence of human rights and their universality. The other indication, again, emerging out of the 51st session of the Human Rights Council, is just the distribution of votes. Not only has the Council voted in favor of a UN Special Rapporteur for the first time investigating the human rights conditions of the P5 states, but the countries who voted in favor of that and other resolutions didn't vote necessarily as ideological blocs. So, for example, Muslim majority states were divided on the Russia resolution, whereas they have been unified on other resolutions. At the national level, we've heard a little bit about the issue of populism, and what is perhaps most, the tools of populists aren't particularly novel, but what we're starting to see in the current era, post the 1990s, is a real decoupling between democracy and populism, which is something that presents particularly fresh challenges for human rights proponents. Also complicating the picture for human rights activists and scholars is the outsized power of corporates and investors, the increasingly securitized global and national agendas, and the difficulties caused by issues like disinformation and new technologies in capturing public imaginations and the marketplace of ideas. So against this backdrop, Melanie McAllister, for example, talks about how human rights activists need to be a little bit more creative in the search for allies. And she speaks a little bit about religious groups and how they're not monoliths. And there's an opportunity to forge more broad brush alliances. The book also goes into systemic issues, particularly focusing on tech. We've already heard from Kate about the sort of geopolitical race and the opportunities that technology presents to create a particular vision of the world. Also discussed in the book is how technology exposes gaps within the framework and how there's work to be done in filling those gaps with norms that have been tried and tested, as Kate has said, for decades and carefully calibrated. But the book is not comprehensive in terms of its approach to cross-cutting challenges. There are other regions as well to focus on, and some of the more existential threats that human rights will have to address going forward include the climate emergency. People have already spoken about gross inequality, there will also be increasingly migration and demographic pressures to contend with. So the work at Chatham House very much continues on all of those fronts, including through the Human Rights Pathways Initiative led by the International Law Programme. And I would argue that in an increasingly fragmented world, there is a greater role to be played by parties like Chatham House, who offer a neutral and therefore dispassionate assessment of where the road could be going forward and the kind of adaptations that the human rights system will have to make. We heard a little bit from Rana about how authoritarian regimes exploit emergency responses, and the pandemic, as well as the war in Ukraine, will further exacerbate the kind of vulnerabilities that individuals face, including through ever accelerating inequality, creating added stresses on the multilateral system on which human rights depends. So the questions and the investigations are urgent ones. But to end on a slightly more positive note, the issues, as Rana has also pointed to, are long-standing ones. They are issues and risks of high probability as well as high impact. And what the recent years have demonstrated is simply where the weaknesses are and precipitated the pace at which we need to come up with solutions. But fragmentation has also created space for smaller states. The ambassador spoke about emerging rights to the environment. These were very much led by small island states in some quarters and through alliances within the global south. Another example, and this is by no means exhaustive, is the example of leadership from African states on issues of discrimination and the post-colonial legacies following the sort of political opening that was created by the murder of George Floyd. And as a consequence, the UN has established a commission of inquiry into systemic racism in law enforcement contexts, not only in the US, but beyond. I'll leave it there.
So thumbs up, thumbs down on the book.
Thumbs up, but more, maybe a part two.
Good. And she has an ongoing project too that's exploring many of these themes and others as well. So questions. There's a roving microphone. I'm going to take a bunch of them. So we'll start here, and then we'll go there, and then we'll go there. Okay, take 4 first. Yes, go ahead, please, and introduce yourself, please. And there are a few online too.
Hi, my name is Nikki. I'm a fellow at the Chatham House's Digital Society Initiative. My question about the impact of emerging technologies on human rights. So my first question is about how do you see the impact of emerging technologies like AI and big data on the future of work, especially the labor rights? Because we have read a lot of reports about how employers kind of manipulate those technologies over workers' rights. And the second question, as you mentioned, we needed to kind of integrate human rights in the design of algorithm and also the early development of technologies. How do we do that from an international laws perspective? Is there any way to regulate it from very beginning rather than later on? Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. There's another hand here. Someone else? There we go, right here. And then we'll go over there.
Hi, my name is Lenka Vachkotová, and I have a question for Kate because she mentioned ITU. So my question is whether you think that the right to have encrypted conversations through WhatsApp and the others should be a fundamental right, given that in China, they are reading the encrypted conversations. In the UK, they are discussing right now to open people's conversations and read them in the name of, looking for terrorist content and so on. So I would like to get your view on that.
Thank you very much. We'll take 2 more questions. Go ahead.
So this is Sudarshan. I'm a MPA student at the LSE.
He's a student of mine, so feel sorry for him.
So my question is to you, sir. First question, when you mentioned that UNHRC has a budget problem, so are there any provisions relating to working with regional and sub-regional organizations on human rights issue? For example, ECOWAS in relation to Tuaregs and ASEAN with respect to Rohingyas. That's first question. And the second question is that when we are considering issues of institutions in today's time, when they are facing entropy, and when we have a situation that policy entrepreneurs are becoming a thing, is the UN working on something to develop these policy entrepreneurs to work on human rights in their respective countries? So these are
Thank you. That's good. You talk more now than you did in class. Yeah. And then this question right here, and then I'll get to you in a second.
Hi, my name is Alina Cabra, and I'm a politics and IR student at Queen Mary. My question is for the ambassador. Well, firstly, thank you all for being here today. I read some of the book on the website, and I can't wait to read the rest. If you don't mind, my question starts with a couple examples. Firstly, in 2018, the British airstrikes in Syria were not legal, as neither the UN Charter nor international law permitted that military action on the basis of humanitarian intervention. No one was held accountable. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, the Universal Periodic Review process has been more about praising states than holding states accountable. So now my question is, what can the United Nations, particularly the United Nations Human Rights Council, do to be more effective as an institution in holding states accountable?
Thank you. I'm going to add one question from an online question because it relates to that, which is from Robert Parnes. To what extent, if at all, are human rights taken into account in the development of new weaponry systems by the private sector defense industry, particularly in the development of click warfare capacity aimed at information disruption, et cetera? Are there any international bodies regulating this or maintaining some form of oversight? I'll answer this partially first because we have a chapter on this. Thompson Chengeda wrote specifically on the issue of automated weapon system, autonomous weapon systems, and AI, argues that in fact, and goes to your point in part two, is that there's no accountability over how these weapon systems are used and often have racist implications. His argument, and this goes to you, Robert, I'm looking at you as if you're there, is basically the issue of, there is a need for the UN and other bodies to develop the accountability mechanisms. And he calls for actually a broader sort of movement to demand greater accountability on this and to demand that the private sector actually be more accountable for the sale and use of these weapons and how they're applied. So it is partially answered here. It's a good, but I want to let the actual panelists answer these questions. Let's go in reverse order. Well, actually, Rana, did you have any comments on any of this? Did you want to add?
Well, Chris, I don't think I have because when Kay Jones is here, I cannot answer on technology, so I'll leave it.
Okay. Free ride if you like. Oh, Rosemary, did you have any comments?
Just one quick one, Chris, and that is, I mean, on the weapon systems, the only thing I know about, and it's not a topic that I work on, but I know that there has been a lot of discussion within the UN, and Secretary General Guterres, among others, has been very concerned about the use of explosive weapons within civilian areas in armed conflict and so on. And again, there is a body that has been looking at that and trying to impose, obviously, restrictions on that. But as for the wider thing, the wider question, I think this again has become a question or a debate about ethics rather than a debate about rights, actually, about the way in which certainly these weaponries are used. On the question about the Universal Periodic Review and how to make it stronger and a source of accountability. Again, I think one of the things to do in this first step is to expose actually what has been happening with it. I mean, again, it is a very good procedure. It's a very good addition to a human rights body, but actually to be aware of the way in which it's being misused, I think is an important first step to uncover before we start thinking about ways of bringing it back to the original intention of that process.
Thank you. Kate.
Yes, thank you. A couple of questions that were for me. First from Nikki over there. AI and the future of work and human rights. This is such an important issue. And it's an issue that, in my view, governments ought to be leading the way on. It's part of strategic planning that AI is going to change the way that people are in the workplace and the employment opportunities that are available, governments need to be thinking ahead about how to deal with that issue. And if need be, talking to the developers of technology on it, absolutely, really, really important. Secondly, how to integrate human rights in the development of AI, hugely important. I mean, I mentioned before that there are now at least 170 sets of AI ethics principles. Attention has now moved from what you do with those principles, so what processes companies should actually follow to get ethics into their work. And people are looking at processes of algorithmic audits and impact assessment. And from our point of view and the human rights side, what we would say is that in developing those processes, they should again take account of the extensive expertise in human rights impact assessment that there is, thanks to the Ruggie principles, which say that all companies have a responsibility to respect human rights. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights in Geneva, through their BTEC project, has been doing fantastic work on this, saying this is what companies need to do in order to take account of human rights in algorithmic development. But what I would say is that quite a few of the algorithmic assessment processes that I've looked at are deficient in a couple of ways. One of them is that they tend to think about ethics, usually, right at the beginning of the process, rather than on a continuing basis. And what we see often with AI is that how it manifests itself can change over time, right? Because it's self-learning. So therefore, you need to be continually looking for risks rather than just at the outset. The second thing I would say about this is that actually implementing these processes is turning out to be really complex. So it is still an iterative process trying to look for a way that tech designers can properly have these human rights impact assessments while at the same time moving on in a relatively efficient manner with the rollout of new technology. And that's something we need to think about a bit more, again, so that it doesn't wipe smaller players out of the market. So it's a big growth area at the moment and really, really important. Thirdly, there was a question for me specifically about WhatsApp and end-to-end encryption. It's a really, really tricky issue. And the way that we have seen it play out in the UK and the debate on the online safety bill is that on the one hand, you have a lot of the human rights community saying, well, freedom of expression and privacy are absolutely key. You need to preserve end-to-end encryption. For human rights defenders and many others around the world, this is absolutely vital. On the other hand, you've had the child rights community saying that it is end-to-end encrypted messages which are responsible for an awful lot of the spreading of child pornography and therefore are fueling some of this industry, which is having a terrible impact on children. So you've got these two imperatives. Now, what the online safety bill tries to do is to say, okay, we're going to try and look for ways to enable both of those. And so what it talks about is the possibility of future technology that doesn't yet exist that would allow you to do some sort of scanning for material which is this awful abuse of children, yeah, only that, but doesn't actually read the contents of the message unless there is actually a problem with it. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, that's actually not possible. And if you open the door to that, then the risk is that you're opening the door to much wider reading of messages and so on. And that's the debate that's going on. Personally, I feel that if you can genuinely find a way of squaring the circle, then that's okay. If you can't, then clearly you shouldn't break up the encryption. It's a bit like going through airport security, right? I know that when I put my bags through airport security, they're being scanned for weapons and other dangerous things. That's fine. If they were being scanned and the computer was finding out, you know, what brands of clothing I have and what cosmetics I use, so that it could then sell me adverts and it could start to profile me and it could start to decide on my political and my religious persuasion and so on, I would have a real problem with airport scanning as well. So I see it as a kind of an analogous situation to that. Finally, just quickly on the development of warfare. I'm sorry, Chris, for taking
No,
so
no,
long.
no, I was just looking at him because I had a
Okay.
question, but I don't think we're
Okay, okay.
going to have enough time. so we should have enough-
Firstly, IHL applies just as it does in any other situation. And there are lots of debates about that in the UN, but we have to get to the bottom of that. Secondly, if you like, it's the sharp end of what we were talking about before, of the development of AI, taking account of human rights right from the beginning. Yeah, okay, that's enough from me.
That's excellent, though, really. Chana, you've worked, before I turn to the ambassador to wrap up, you've worked on AI and the role of the private sector and the obligation of the private sector. Do you want to just add a few notes from your work on this?
Kate's the author of that paper, so like Rana, I'll defer to Kate.
Just kidding, you're carrying the whole entire panel. You want to answer the ambassador too? Ambassador Villegas, the final words and your reflection, a lot of good questions your way,
Yeah,
and also
very
just
good,
your thoughts
very
on
good.
the overall issue.
Okay, thanks a lot for the questions. And the budget problem, the Office of the High Commissioner is the heart that pumps the blood of human rights in the whole human rights. It has $140 million, that's the 4% I'm talking, and it has $240 million of donors, of bilateral cooperation to the office. So that's something that needs to change, and I think the private sector we should go from corporate social responsibility, we were able to go to business and human rights. But sincerely, I think we have to go to the next stage. And the next stage is the ownership of the private sector of the human rights idea. Because what we need is that private companies realize that invest in human rights is a smart investment decision. It's not philanthropy, it's not to have a safe face for stock. It's something that is, so if we can get these weapons system factories to realize from the beginning that to invest in human rights, if you are able to develop a drone and refrain yourself from putting a software for that drone to identify color of skins before they drop the bomb, which is actually what they are doing now. Today, we are having drones being developed, killer robots, with the possibility of identifying color of skin before they drop the bomb. So if we can put the human rights chip since the beginning with the private sector. So that's, and we are doing things, and I will invite here to listen to the speech of the UK and other developed countries that develop weapons, by the way, when the resolution was presented last Friday to approve, that I mentioned, on the impact of human rights of new military technologies. And the first thing they said, countries that build the weapons, is we should not mix, this is not a human rights issue. We should continue to deal with in the laws discussion on disarmament. So first thing is to get a leap of faith by the developed countries that are so much behind the human rights idea to put the human rights idea in the development of weapons. Then on accountability and the UPR, I understand the point, and I think Rosemary also made the point. The UPR was never thought for accountability. Let's go back to the idea. The UPR was created, why? Because for 50 years, we didn't address ever the human rights situation of 187 countries. Never Saudi Arabia had to be before a table saying why women could not drive a car. That didn't exist for 50 years. So the UPR was never thought for accountability. That's why in the same resolution we created the UPR, it was thought for having every single country of the world putting their human rights situation on the table, every other. And you know what? We are starting the 4th cycle in November. That means for 3 times, 193 states had to put their human rights situation on this exercise. But the addressing human rights situation and accountability was another tool, which is the special sessions, the urgent debates, the special rapporteurs. We have 13 special rapporteur and accountability mechanisms on countries and 40 special rapporteurs on thematic issues. thematic issues that are not fashionable, but they exist, like the special rapporteur on albinism. And I was in Africa, and albinism countries, albine people suffer a lot of violations of human rights for many reasons. So there's another way of looking at accountability, and unfortunately, it's not the UPR. It was not thought for that.
Let's stop there, unfortunately, because I don't want to run too far. We've
That's it.
gone 5 minutes over. You will all, there's a reception, so you'll all have a chance to ask you questions in person. So I apologize if you didn't get a chance to. So first of all, I want to thank the Ford Foundation for supporting this project. They were the ones who believed in it. I want to again repeat my support for my appreciation to Amanda and Caroline for their work on this throughout, and the Brookings Institution and Chatham House generally. I want to thank you all for coming. Just one quick anecdote. When we were preparing this halfway through, we had a meeting with through the South African Institute for International Affairs and others with their sort of youth networks. And one of the things that really stuck with me, and I talk about this in the forward, is I sort of thought that there would be a moment when we got 20-something students and young professionals to talk about their perspectives on human rights, would hear sort of dismissiveness about it, or what's relevant to me, or why not economic. And one person among all of them, but one person said it very eloquently. She said, "We're the generation that grew up in human rights." And so we can lament the challenges and the tensions over human rights right now, but it's been 75 years, 74 years. There's been real progress, and it's difficult to imagine that progress being turned all the way back. And there are challenges. And I think, again, your attendance here, I appreciate you coming and listening. Your enthusiasm, your questions demonstrates that this is, we're moving forward. It's not a time to despair. It's a time to take stock and to refresh that language, our commitments, and so on in ways. Luckily, we have a great president of the UNHRC who's willing to be here. So please join me in thanking not just the panelists here, but all of the authors who contributed, who couldn't be here but are going to contribute. So thank you very much for coming. Please enjoy the reception.